The big news in international affairs over the last couple of hours as we head into the weekend is first the continuing tremors, geopolitical tremors, following the meeting of Xi Jinping with Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and the situation in the financial system, the Western financial system. More about both of these later in this program, but I will, as I traditionally do, focus initially on a relatively brief rundown today on the military situation in Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine remains very much at the epicenter of the broader geopolitical realignment which is now underway in the world. And as Alex Christoforou and I recently discussed on the Duran, it has a significant part to play in the financial crisis which we're now starting to see in the West. So let's start first of all with what's actually going on the battlefields in Ukraine. And we can begin by making a few observations about the situation drawn from Redovka, this newspaper, as I said, that's published in Smolensk region, which has a strongly patriotic, nationalist, pro-war position in Russia, provides a Russian perspective of what is going on the battlefields, but which, as I've said previously, has many reporters on the ground, apparently, or at least has access to a lot of information about what is going on the ground, and which, of course, provides us with a summary of the situation, which I have found generally to be accurate. So what does it tell us about the situation overall today? First of all, it discusses the situation in Bakhmut, and it says that soldiers of the Wagner organization are advancing in the area of Bogdanovka and Orekhovo-Vasilievka. Well, this is consistent with what we have already known for some time. Fierce battles continue in Bakhmut. The Russian armed forces are consistently crushing the Ukrainian military in the city center, and the enemy is suffering heavy losses. In addition, Wagner troops are advancing on Predtetkino, I'm not quite sure where this particular village is, and have also reached the southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut. Fighting continues in the Ivanivska area. Now, I've slightly modified this dispatch. Of course, it uses Russian names for these locations. It calls Bakhmut Artyomovsk. It refers to Krasnoye instead of Ivanivska, but it does give us an overall picture of what's going on. And note that it appears to be saying that whilst the Russians continue to maintain pressure on the villages around Bakhmut, these various villages that sit astride all these main roads, the major focus now is on the fighting inside Bakhmut itself, and it suggests that Bakhmut is indeed, that the Russians are indeed making significant progress there. Now, we're not getting detailed information about the Russians, about the fighting inside Bakhmut. There have been some reports which do suggest that the Russians are indeed gaining ground. And there was a very, very interesting satellite photograph published on Slavyangrad, which appeared to show where the major firefights are taking place. It was a night picture. You could see the sort of flashes of light in Bakhmut. And my own impression is that they're now concentrated in a relatively small part of the town, which suggests that the actual area of the town under Ukrainian control is now relatively small. I'm not going to go into more details about this because obviously I don't know. But note nothing here on this Redovka report about a Ukrainian counterattack in and around Bakhmut. And on the topic of a Ukrainian counterattack in the area of Bakhmut, there's been a very interesting report on Larry Johnson's website, Sonar 21. Larry Johnson being a former CIA analyst, a member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, somebody who's been, in my opinion, one of the most astute commentators about the war in Ukraine, but also somebody who has access to various people in the US intelligence community, something which I, of course, don't have, and not just the US intelligence community, but who has access to information from various people who also have information which, shall we say, is private within the US government. And he passes on a report, some comments he's received from a friend who he said is well plugged in with the Ukrainian side. And Larry Johnson said that he considers this information reliable, and he discusses the Ukrainian counterattack, the much discussed, much talked about Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut. And I'm going to read it. It's on an open site. I'm going to read it in full. This is the report, the comments that Larry Johnson has received from this friend of his that clearly derived from some text. I'm not going to speculate more about that. And it reads as follows. Vladimir Zelensky, that's of course the president of Ukraine, visited Chasov Yar today, that was a couple of days ago in fact, to kick off an offensive to relieve Bakhmut and push the Russians back. A number of armoured and artillery brigades are being moved down from the north to support such a relief operation. Now that already is an interesting piece of information because it suggests that the Ukrainians are being forced to redeploy troops from one part of the front line to another. And where are these troops coming from? Well, one possibility is that they're coming from Kharkiv region, where the Russians have been pressing the Ukrainians hard in recent weeks. And that might explain why the Russians continue, as we'll discuss in a moment, to make progress in Kharkiv region, pushing hard on Ukrainian lines around Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, and the rest. And the other possibility, perhaps the more plausible possibility, is that they've been pulled back. These are Ukrainian troops who have been pulled away from the Belarus-Russian border in the north, which supposedly, as a result, has now been stripped bare of troops. And there have been a number of rumours that this is the case for some time, and the north rather suggests that. Now, that might be a risky thing to do because perhaps not by coincidence, there's now been a major Russian air raid on the town of Sumy in the north of Ukraine, and apparently the Russians launched attacks, bomb raids, airstrikes on various positions, Ukrainian positions around Sumy. Apparently it was one of the largest air raids in this area that the Russians have launched for a very long time. And apparently the Russians used precision-guided guide bombs, JDAMS bombs, I'm not going to go into further details about this. This is another topic for another day. But it turns out that the Russians do have bombs of this kind, just as the Americans do, and the Russians are using them in Ukraine, and they use them around Sumy. But anyway, the Ukrainians have been obliged to redeploy troops from the north. It might have been Svatov, Kremenaya, Kharkiv region that they've come from, but it could also be the northern border, in which case the northern border is being left to a great extent unprotected. But anyway, let's press on. This is going back to this report. Chasov Yar may be 4 or so miles from Bakhmut. Zelensky can no longer chance a visit to Bakhmut as he did earlier this month. As we have noted before, there are somewhere between 15 to 20,000 Ukrainian troops fighting inside Bakhmut. And Ukraine's area of control, this is within Bakhmut, is shrinking and is also becoming bifurcated between a larger group in the western centre of the city and the remainder in the northeast of the city. Now that's the clearest account we've yet had of the number of troops Ukraine actually has within Bakhmut itself. 15 to 20,000, more than I'd guesstimated. I thought it'd be more like 9 to 10,000. Seems there's many more troops than that in Bakhmut, Ukrainian troops than that in Bakhmut. 15 to 20,000, and that corresponds with some of the highest estimates that we've seen from various Russian commentators, and also from Dima at the Military Summary channel, by the way. It's higher than I had imagined. And by the way, if there are that many Ukrainian troops fighting in Bakhmut, that explains the relatively slow progress that's taking place as the Russians work to clear Bakhmut itself. And that, I think, is sufficient to explain the slow movements there. And notice the other point, that this force of 15 to 20,000 Ukrainian troops, its area of control in Bakhmut is shrinking, which corresponds with the information I'm seeing from Russian sources, for example, from Slavyangrad, that satellite picture that I spoke about, which shows the areas where the firefights are taking place and the shelling is taking place. And it also confirms what has been hinted at by Russian reports, which is that Ukrainian forces within Bakhmut are starting to become divided, that the Ukrainian force inside Bakhmut is bifurcating, that there is a force in the northeast of the city, that's essentially the area of the Azov plant, supposedly largely cleared by the Russians, also the industrial zone, the areas around it, and also the western centre of the city. And notice that's where the larger force is located, and notice that that corresponds exactly with the information we've just had from Redovka, that the Russians are now, as Redovka says, confidently fighting the Ukrainian troops in the center of the city. So that's an interesting explanation from what looks like an authoritative source about what's going on in Bakhmut itself. And we can see that the Russians, despite various claims, are making progress and are gradually taking the town methodically. It's hard work, given, as I said, that there's 15 to 20,000 Ukrainian troops there. But those Ukrainian troops, as we've seen, are now in effect cut off from resupply. And then, to continue this report, sources report that Leopard and Challenger tanks have been moved into position for the relief operation, even though the room for tank manoeuvres is not great because of the bad weather, rain and mud. I understand, by the way, that the weather is now improving. Temperatures have risen, and that might mean, or presumably will mean before very long, that the mud is going to start to harden and it'll be possible to move tanks and tracked vehicles more successfully in this area. But we'll come to that in a moment. And then we come to the next paragraph. Some experts think this relief operation will last only 4 or 5 days and may start as early as tomorrow. It can't go much longer than that because Ukraine has limited reserves and cannot afford a long battle or stalemate with the Russians. It is anticipated this will be a very bloody battle and could be decisive for both sides. Now, the 4 to 5 days time window that Ukraine has in order to complete this operation is something I have seen in various other sources, that the time window is small. And if Ukraine is going to carry out this attack, it's got to succeed within 4 to 5 days, which I would have thought is a very tall order indeed. And then we have the most interesting parts of the analysis. This is from this friend of Larry Johnson. Zelensky is acting outside of the advice he's getting from the US and NATO, which desires a frontal attack on Crimea and not at Bakhmut or further south, Avdiivka, which is also under Russian attack and potential encirclement. So Zelensky and Syrsky, his ground forces commander, through their insistence on holding on to Bakhmut, wanting to continue this battle, they are acting contrary to the advice of the US and of NATO. Now, I don't think there is any doubt about that. We've had commentary after commentary in the Western media. I've passed on all this information, commentary after commentary, which makes it entirely clear that the US military, the Pentagon, NATO chiefs are extremely worried and very concerned that Ukraine is overinvesting in Bakhmut, that it's frittering away precious reserves, precious ammunition, manpower, equipment. We now see reports that Leopard 2 tanks and even Challenger 2 tanks are being deployed to this area on what might be only a 4 to 5 day counterattack. And all of this is being done instead of concentrating on this much more important, at least so the Western powers think, much more important counteroffensive in the south. It is a diversion of resources in an area, Bakhmut, which it is not realistic or sensible for Ukraine to go on fighting over. And the Western powers apparently also feel the same way about Avdiivka as well. They think that Avdiivka, like Bakhmut, is a lost cause and Ukraine is only reinforcing failure by attacking there. And then the article then goes on, rather these comments from this friend of Larry Johnson's go on. If the Russians lose at Bakhmut, in other words, if the Ukrainian counterattack is successful, it presages a much longer war, perhaps years, And we've seen that that's not at all what the United States wants. Up till now, the Russians have been operating slowly and methodically, but this will go out of the window with a fierce rescue operation. If Ukraine loses, it suggests that the Ukrainian military will have squandered much of its offensive capability, and it could lead to a chaotic outcome. In fact, it would be a disaster for Ukraine. And then Larry Johnson makes his own points. The odds are stacked against the Ukrainians. They cannot match the Russians in terms of artillery shells, rates of fire. Russia, like the United States and NATO, has robust intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. That means Russia should be monitoring the build-up of Ukrainian assets in Chasiv Yar. Well, we know they have done because we've had lots of reports about this from the Russian side, and should be prepared to bring to bear an enormous volume of fire on any attacking columns. And I think that is correct. He goes on to say that Russia enjoys a critical logistics capability in this looming fight. It can rapidly reinforce troops in this sector and can supply the ammunition necessary to sustain intense fire. And he says that there are reports in the last few days that the intensity of fighting in Bakhmut has lessened. Whilst lack of ammunition is one possibility, an unlikely one, I think a better explanation is that Russia is witting of the upcoming attack and is laying in wait to conduct a devastating ambush. Well, that's Larry Johnson's analysis, and he may very well be right. But as I said already, I think that this idea that there has in fact been a reduction of the intensity of the fighting in Bakhmut is probably wrong. It overlooks the realities of what is actually going on in Bakhmut itself, where the Russians are steadily making ground, reducing, defeating this very large Ukrainian garrison, which is in that town. Now, as I said, the Ukrainians are having problems getting resupplied, but of course they will have stocked up. They will have stocks of ammunition, food, fuel, so they can keep fighting at a large, heavy rate of intensity for some time. And Larry Johnson concludes that a Russian defeat in Bakhmut will not alter Russia's objectives in this war. It would lead up to a shake-up in military command and a significant escalation in Russia's use of force against Ukraine. It would buy Ukraine some time and re-energize the West's commitment to expand support to Ukraine, all of which I think is probably true. It would be a very embarrassing blow for the Russians, but it would not be a fatal one. But then he goes on to say a Ukrainian defeat, however, will be devastating and decisive. If Russia crushes the counterattack, it will represent the slaughter of some of Ukraine's most capable troops and the loss of recently supplied equipment and ammunition that is already in short supply. A Ukrainian failure will eliminate Western optimism that Ukraine can produce a military miracle and will make NATO allies think twice before agreeing to pour more resources into the maw of Ukraine. And about that, I am fully in agreement. So, if it is Ukraine's intention to launch this counterattack in and around Bakhmut, and as I said, the weather conditions are now starting to make that possible, it looks like a very, very high-risk gamble indeed. Now, there are some reasons to think that Zelensky and the people around him are starting to have doubts. Zelensky, as this report says, visited Chasiv Yar a few days ago, and he also visited Kherson region. And then on returning to Kiev, he gave an interview to Japan's largest newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun. And over the course of it, he seemed to sound extremely pessimistic about the military situation and appeared to discount the prospects of a counterattack. He says, the quotation I've seen is the following: "We can't launch a counteroffensive yet. Without tanks, artillery, and HIMARS, we cannot send our brave soldiers to the front lines." And Zelensky pointed out that his forces are suffering from serious shortage of ammunition, and they're still waiting for this ammunition to arrive from the West. By the way, he also, over the course of this interview, expressed skepticism about the Chinese peace plan. I'll come to that shortly. And now, there's two views about this Zelensky interview. The one is that this is all a deception operation, which it might very well be. It's intended to put the Russians, to lull the Russians into some sort of complacency, to make the Russians discount the possibility that a Ukrainian counterattack is coming, whether in Bakhmut or a broader offensive, a bigger offensive, like the one we've seen much talked about in the Zaporozhye area. But there is at least one other possibility, that Zelensky has been touring the battle lines. He's been meeting the local commanders in Chasov Yar, near Bakhmut, in Kherson region, and they're all telling him the same story, that Ukraine is out of men, out of machines, out of ammunition. It would make no sense to launch a counterattack now. They need time to prepare. They need more time to call up more troops, to assimilate these Western weapons, these Leopard 2 tanks and these Challenger 2 tanks, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the Stryker wheeled vehicles, the Marder vehicles, all of those. Above all, they need more ammunition. They're out of ammunition. An offensive cannot be sustained if Ukraine only has enough ammunition to fire around 3,000 rounds a day, at a time when the Russians, on an average day, are continuing to fire around 20,000 rounds. Going back to Larry Johnson, he talked about the Ukrainians advancing straight into devastating Russian artillery barrages if they tried to launch an attack in Bakhmut. And quite plausibly, that is what the commanders, both in Kherson region and in Bakhmut, the Bakhmut area, are warning Zelensky against. And as to the manpower problems, there's been a long article about this in the Wall Street Journal. And I would like to take an opportunity to thank the person who supplied me with a copy of this article, which is not paywalled. And it was made very, very interesting reading. It conceded that Ukraine is now running into severe manpower problems, that the ability to continue to call in volunteers, to mobilize soldiers, that was the case earlier in the war, at the start of the war, a year ago, that's running down, that there are fewer men willing to be called up. And despite the fact that the Wall Street Journal still tries to give an optimistic spin on some of these problems, tending to discount their importance, it doesn't take much trouble to read between the lines and to see that there are real problems now, real manpower problems now affecting Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is going to have more troops coming from the West. The I get varying numbers, 30,000 some say, 75,000 others say, all of these troops that have been trained in the West. Trained, well, they've received a couple of weeks training in the West. It's been suggested that they were previously trained in Ukraine itself before they were sent to the West for further training. I have to say that those that were sent in Britain, there have been interviews with some of them, and my impression is that they'd received no prior training at all, just saying. But anyway, there are some of these troops coming, but perhaps not enough to fill the gaps and to make up for the losses that Ukraine has already suffered. So, one way or the other, it could be, that Zelensky is himself starting to have second doubts about the Bakhmut counterattack, about the Zaporozhye counterattack. I suspect that with the weather improving, with the temperatures rising, we're going to find out about that within the next few days. Perhaps even as this program starts to be broadcast, we will find out what the Ukrainians actually intend to do in and around Bakhmut within the next few days. But to reiterate again, despite what has been suggested by some people in the Western media, despite the story that the British Defence Ministry is trying to spin, they were again suggesting conflicts between the Wagner organisation and the Russian military today. Though I have to say, for the moment, those disagreements which have existed in the past appear to have abated. The reality is that the Russians, the Wagner organisation troops, are continuing to press forward inside Bakhmut. If there isn't a Ukrainian counterattack very soon, then it seems to me that the situation is going to become irretrievable. And to say it frankly, if a counterattack is not possible, then I would have thought that Ukraine ought to do that which I think it ought to have done a long time ago, and, by the way, which the Pentagon also thinks, which is pull its troops out of Bakhmut to the extent that that is still possible. Conceivably, since it's clear to me now that the Russians want to wrap up this fighting in Bakhmut as soon as they can, it might be possible to negotiate some sort of terms for these troops to withdraw. Well, that might be an option. It could at least be tried. I noticed, by the way, that in the latest prisoner releases, Ukraine seems to have released some injured Russian troops unilaterally without getting a reciprocal release of troops from the Russians. Could that possibly be a hint that some kind of discussions about getting these men out of Bakhmut are underway? I don't know, and I don't want to guess, but perhaps just possibly that is what that was all about. So anyway, that's the situation in Bakhmut as of the time of making this program. But can I stress again, we're clearly now in a rapidly moving, dynamic situation in Bakhmut. It could be that things are going to change. They may be very different by the time this program is broadcast. Anyway, returning now to Redovka, they also talk about the situation in Avdiivka. They say after the liberation of Novobakhmutovka, the Russian army continues to cover Avdiivka. Aviation, the Russian Air Force, is actively working on the position of the Ukrainian army. In other words, the Russian Air Force in this area of the combat zone is continuing to conduct airstrikes. To the north of Krasnogorovka, the Russian armed forces have reached Stepnoye and Berdichi. Stepnoye is a village which has at various times been reported by various commentators as having been already captured by the Russians. Well, it seems that they've now reached it, so perhaps they will capture it fairly soon. And then we also have this report: fighting continues in Marinka. And Redovka then quotes an interview which Denis Pushilin, the head of the regional government of Donetsk, has given to Russian television. And over the course of that interview, Pushilin said that Marinka is now all but entirely captured by the Russians. There's only one small area left on the western, in the western suburbs of this relatively small town, and the impression I got from Pushilin's words, at least the way they've been reported, is that he expects this particular small area to be captured by the Russians fairly soon, in which case, finally, several months after the Russians first said that they'd captured Marinka, it will indeed have been captured. Now, Marinka is important because if Marinka falls, then that will put very heavy pressure on Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar. And if Marinka falls and the Vuhledar fall, then the Russians not only have a very strong logistical presence in this area of Ukraine, but they also are able to control or reopen railway lines that they have not been using because they are in too close proximity to Vuhledar, where the Ukrainians can shell that railway if the Russians use it. And that will obviously simplify Russian supply lines and make any Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye more difficult. Note that Redovka, by contrast, does not provide much in the way of information about the situation on the northern front in Kharkiv region, in the area of Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman and Kupiansk. However, Russian officials today say that they now control 29 settlements in this area, which I believe is an increase from 20 a few weeks ago. Of course, a settlement can mean much or little. It depends on the size and the importance. It's clear that the Russians have not captured any big places up to now, but there is no doubt at all that they're continuing to make progress in this area. And even if their overall stance continues to be defensive, as various commentators, including the British Ministry of Defence, are saying, nonetheless, it does seem to be the case that they have a predominance of force in this part of the battlefronts, and with Ukrainian troops relocated to Bakhmut, it's perhaps understandable why they're continuing to make their advances here in the north. Anyway, that's the overall picture on the battlefronts. Now, it could be that partly because of the growing pessimism, if you like, about the situation in Ukraine and the report that Larry Johnson has published from his friend conveys, I think, some of the feeling that there now is in the West about how difficult this war is turning out to be, how things are not going at all the way that it was hoped that they would. Anyway, perhaps reflecting that, there's been an interesting article in, of all places, The Atlantic, another very strongly shall we say, Democrat Party oriented magazine. It was the magazine, by the way, in which Barack Obama gave his valedictory interview as president back in 2016, the one in which he warned the US political class that in Ukraine, Russia would always hold escalatory dominance over the US. Anyway, that is this magazine. That's the nature of this magazine. But anyway, there's been a piece by a person called Mario Loyola, who we are told is was a defense policy advisor of the Pentagon and the US Senate. And Mario Loyola supports the original comments that Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, by the way, to some extent retracted since then by Ron DeSantis, basically saying that this was simply a border dispute between Russia and Ukraine, and why is the United States so invested in this conflict? Anyway, Mario Loyola basically says that Ron DeSantis, at least in his original perspective, was right, and he suggests that Ukraine might be better off as a more homogeneous society, limiting itself to the Ukrainian-speaking regions of Ukraine, which in effect is a call on Ukraine to consider territorial concessions. As I said, there is a debate about Ukraine going on in the United States, something you do not find, emphatically do not find, in Britain. There's probably some kind of a debate going on in Europe as well, at least in Germany, but it's less visible in the United States. It just about manages to reflect itself in the open, though it's clear that for the moment, the hardliners, the neocons, if you prefer, backed strongly by the US president, by Joe Biden himself, remain firmly in the ascendant and are not prepared to give up on their Ukraine adventure. Anyway, moving on, it's now becoming clear that problems for the United States are building up in various other places as well. There's been a sudden deterioration of the security situation in eastern Syria, where the United States continues to keep troops, most unwisely, in my opinion, and very much against the wishes of all the regional countries: Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, I suspect increasingly Jordan as well. And we're starting to see now an acceleration of political events in the Middle East. The whole situation in the Middle East has transformed over the last few years, but the pace of that transformation has accelerated with the diplomatic revolution that China has engineered in the Middle East, specifically the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And following, shortly after that event, there have been reports, in fact there's confirmation, that Saudi Arabia and Syria, in other words, Saudi Arabia and Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, are now preparing to resume diplomatic relations. And it's only, I think, now a matter of time before Syria is fully reinstated in the Arab League, bringing the war in Syria to an effective end. All that remains, last part of the puzzle, is the reconciliation between Syria and Turkey, The Russians are still working on a major summit meeting bringing together the presidents of Syria and Turkey, Assad and Erdogan, and also the presidents of Russia, Putin, and of Iran, President Raisi. Now, I would say, by the way, there's been much talk about the fact that there's elections coming in Turkey. There's lots of debate about who's going to win those elections. I personally believe that President Erdogan will win these elections, despite the very difficult economic situation in Turkey. I still feel that he has a critical mass of support in Turkey from much of the population. And I also think that having been in power for so long, well, let's say that he has leverage over the machinery of power, which will make it easier for him to remain president. But of course, I'm not certain about this, but what I will say is also this. I've seen some of the statements now that have been coming out of the Turkish opposition. I get the sense that if Erdogan loses the election in Turkey, something which I do not expect, but should that happen, it will not delay the reconciliation between Turkey and Syria. It is more likely to accelerate it. In fact, I saw a very remarkable comment by a Turkish politician who I understand is a prominent member of the Turkish opposition, in which he appeared to suggest, as far as I could understand it, I'm not entirely confident that this is an accurate report, by the way. People in Turkey can correct me if I am wrong. But he appeared to suggest that a good move for Turkey would be for Turkey to recognize the independence of Abkhazia. It's a breakaway region from Georgia, which Russia has recognized as independent since 2008, and also to recognize Russian control of Crimea and of other territories in Ukraine in return for Russian recognition of certain other territories which Turkey is interested in, but not including Syria. Now, I'm not absolutely clear about what the swap that was being suggested was. I'm not even entirely sure that this proposal was even made, or these comments were even made by this Turkish politician. But I have seen them reported in a number of places. I'd be interested to know whether they are true. But one way or the other, they tend to reinforce my feeling that there is now a Turkish consensus which has essentially formed that the relationship with Russia is not to be sacrificed, doesn't hang purely on Erdogan and on Erdogan remaining president of Turkey, and that certainly a rapprochement with Syria is in Turkish interests. Anyway, there we go. So, United States, its forces in Syria, there are not that many of them, probably more than the 2,000 that I've seen some people claim, but I don't know the exact number. But anyway, regardless of that, all the regional powers, including, of course, Syria, which has never consented to their presence in the first place, they all want to see them go. And there have been a number of incidents now involving these forces. There have been reports of the Russian Air Force undertaking overflights over the US base within Syria at Al-Tanf. Well, that is alarming in itself, and it must be concerning for the United States that that is happening, and I can't help but sense that this is, the Russians say that this base at Al-Tanf has long since overstayed its welcome, and that if the United States is prepared to send drones and bombers close to Russian borders, well, the Russians don't see why in that case they shouldn't send their fighter jets flying over this US air base at Al-Tanf. So there was that. And then there's also been reports of attacks on US soldiers and US bases in Syria. And there's even some reports, which I haven't seen confirmed, that some US soldiers have been injured. And there's even some suggestions that some US soldiers may actually have been killed, though I'm far from certain that this is the case. Anyway, the United States, as it traditionally does, has apparently carried out some airstrikes and is threatening more. They're not saying who they think are responsible for these attacks. President Biden has made some curious statements that the United States is not seeking a conflict with Iran. I have to say, when I hear President Biden talking that way, my heart sinks, and it makes me worried that the United States might be doing or thinking about or contemplating precisely that very thing. Anyway, whatever. The US does seem to be in a position where these troops are now coming under serious pressure. And the United States might be short of counter moves, because on the one hand, what exactly does it do? Does it reinforce these forces in eastern Syria, perhaps creating more problems for itself with the regional powers, all of which want them to go? Or does it do that which President Trump, when he was president, repeatedly attempted to do, but was prevented from doing, which is pull them out, which, to be clear, would be the final conclusive end of the Syrian war? I don't know, but that the United States is overextended, of that I have absolutely no doubt, and that its position is becoming increasingly vulnerable in this area, of that I have no doubt either. We've had the United States redeploy A-10 Thunderbolt ground attack aircraft to the Middle East. It's been sold as intended to free up more advanced US air assets for redeployment to the Indo-Pacific region, which is probably true. Of course, Thunderbolts, A-10 Thunderbolts, are specifically well designed for ground attack operations, and it could be that there's concerns that these troops will need support from aircraft of this sort. But anyway, the overall drift of events is clear, and as I said, the United States has a choice always, again, between escalation and retreat, and I suspect that there's arguments about this within the administration. There's, by the way, a very interesting indication of the mood in the Middle East at the moment, which is that there's a video circulating showing President Biden in such, shall we say, an unflattering light. Now, this video is being attributed to the Saudis, to a Saudi television station. I don't know whether this is the case or not. I've seen the video. If it does indeed have a Saudi provenance, and I've seen no evidence to contradict that, then again it shows how personally unpopular President Biden himself is in the Middle East, but also the extent to which the Saudis are now shifting position away from the United States. And by the way, a further piece of economic news might give some clue as to why that is. Because it turns out that the United States government, the administration, is continuing to release oil from the US's already severely depleted strategic oil reserves. And it's doing that in order to continue to put downward pressure on oil prices. The United States government, the Biden administration, has been doing this now for over a year. The reserve is becoming severely depleted, but it persists in doing this. And it's unsurprising, perhaps, that the Saudis must be getting increasingly irritated by this American move. Anyway, there we go. Much more to say about this whole topic, but let's move on to China. And as I said at the start of this program, the repercussions of the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow, they continue to rumble away, but it's clear that lots of things are going on around the world, that there's lots of people looking at and assessing what this all means. And it's also clear that the Europeans have been spooked by it. So Macron, who's got massive problems internally in France, he's nonetheless said that he's going to visit China in a few weeks. Apparently he's going to be accompanied by a senior US official. I'm not sure who this, EU official rather, I'm not sure who this is. I don't think it's Ursula von der Leyen. I think it's more plausibly Charles Michel, who is the president of the European Council. But whatever, apparently he's on the way. Prime Minister of Spain is also apparently planning to visit Beijing very soon. And so apparently are other EU officials. They're all very alarmed by the signs of this Chinese-Russian de facto partnership, alliance, call it what you will. As I think I've said already, we've now seen the revival of the axis of evil theme to describe it in many different sections of the Western media. Caitlin Johnson and Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama have good pieces about this. I'm not going to dwell on this. I would have thought that the previous iteration of the meme, Axis of Evil, by the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s at the time of the Iraq War, well, that didn't lead to anything good. And I can't imagine that this particular iteration will do so either. But anyway, it's clear that the Europeans are spooked by this and they're trying to figure out what it means. They are desperate to avoid a sanctions war with China, but they're obviously concerned that with the world dividing between the Eurasians, China and Russia, and the United States and its friends, they're going to have to pick sides, and that might very well force them into an economic war against China that they're desperate to avoid. So they're all rushing to Beijing to find out what the Chinese are going to say. And I'm going to predict that when they do arrive in Beijing, they will find the Chinese always polite, always willing to listen, always bland in their responses, always repeating the Chinese formulas. Yes, China has peace plans and peace proposals. It always stands for peace. It's not seeking to involve itself in the Ukrainian conflict. There's been an interesting commentary about that from Hu Xijin, the former editor of Global Times. He's given a rather interesting video explanation, as he puts it, of Chinese position with respect to the Ukrainian conflict, that China continues to pursue equidistance between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But notice that the Chinese have not so far agreed to this discussion, this virtual meeting between Xi Jinping and Zelensky that many people were expecting after Xi Jinping's Moscow visit. The attempts to try to set this up have all so far come to nothing. Eventually, no doubt, there will be such a meeting, but the Chinese seem to be in no hurry for it. Now, there's not so far still been any official publication of the joint Russian-Chinese statements by the Russians or the Chinese, but Reuters has provided us with a translation, its translation, of what the joint statement between Russia and China has to say about the Ukrainian conflict. And I'm going to read it out. It reads as follows: the Russian side positively assesses the objective and unbiased position of the Chinese side on the Ukrainian question. The parties are opposed to any states and their blocs damaging the legitimate security interests of other states in order to obtain military, political, and other advantages. The Chinese side positively assesses the willingness of the Russian side to make efforts to restart peace talks as soon as possible. Russia welcomes China's readiness to play a positive role in a political diplomatic settlement of the Ukraine crisis and the constructive ideas set forth in the document drawn up by the Chinese side on China's position on the political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. The parties note that in order to resolve the Ukrainian crisis, it is necessary to respect the legitimate concerns of all countries in the field of security and prevent the formation of bloc confrontation and halt actions that further fuel the conflict. The parties stress that responsible dialogue is the best way for a sustainable resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, and the international community should support constructive efforts in this regard. The parties call for an end to all steps that contribute to the escalation of tension and prolongation of hostilities, to avoid further degradation of the crisis to the point where it could cross over into an uncontrollable phase. The parties oppose all unilateral sanctions imposed in circumvention of the UN Security Council. Well, I have to say, I found that a most interesting statement, because note that it doesn't make any reference to Ukraine's territorial integrity. Rather, its emphasis is on legitimate security concerns. And of course, it was the violation of what the Russians say was their legitimate security concerns by NATO, which were one of the major causes of the war, the whole issue of NATO expansion into Ukraine. And notice also that it appears to call for immediate peace talks between the two sides. So, interesting statement. And yes, I agree that the Chinese are not openly taking sides. It's fairly obvious who their sympathies are with, and it's with the Russians, and who they blame for the conflict, and it is the West, first and foremost, the United States. And what must be causing even greater concern is that President Lula of Brazil who's on his way to Beijing for a 5-day summit meeting, much longer than I suspect the Chinese intend to devote to people like Macron and to the Prime Minister of Spain and whatever other worthies the Europeans send to Beijing. Anyway, President Lula of Brazil is apparently talking about working with the Chinese on setting up a contact group, a entirely different sort of contact group, to negotiate some kind of peace settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. That would, of course, cut out the Western powers. And, of course, Brazil and China, by contrast, are members of the BRICS group, which includes Russia. So I think the Western powers, the United States, the Europeans, are going to be further alarmed by this development. Anyway, we will see where all of this is going. But I'm going to finish with a few words. Overall, and by and large, this remains an attrition war. Even the Western powers are starting to acknowledge this. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has acknowledged it. Josep Borrell is now admitting to it as well. It's also an attrition war which the West is losing. They openly admit now that they cannot keep up with Ukraine's needs. We see that Zelensky is saying that he can't launch a counteroffensive at the moment. Whether or not that is true, we will see. But he says he can't do it because he isn't getting the weapons he needs. The Russians, by contrast, have no shortage of weapons. They're armed and they're getting more arms all the time, so they're well equipped. They're fully able to conduct military operations. They're getting stronger every day. And as I've discussed in previous programs, setting aside any question of whether China is going to supply Russia with weapons or not, with the enormous industrial might of China behind it, the Russians are able to fill up any gaps in whatever supply issues they might have in order to keep their military industries humming away. And of course, their economy doesn't seem to be under any particular pressure anyway. Their inflation rates are now lower than in the West. Industrial output is rising in Russia. Living standards, by the way, are rising also. So it's a war of attrition that the West actually probably can't win with the Chinese taking the position that they're taking. So, what does the West do? Does it continue with this war? Does it instead follow the advice of the author, Mr. Loyola at the Mario Loyola at the Atlantic? Does it seek peace? Well, we shall see. But it's become clear, the latest Brazilian moves make this absolutely clear, that the world is now starting to align increasingly around China and against the West. South Africa is saying that they won't enforce the ICC warrant against Putin. For example, Putin comes to South Africa for the BRICS summit. South Africa won't arrest him, despite South Africa being a party to the Rome Statute. There's a splenetic piece about that, by the way, in the Daily Telegraph, saying that that would make the ICC a nonsense. Well, if so, they should never have published this kind of warrant. So we will see where all this leads. But we can see, anyway, how the geopolitical tectonic plates are moving. And with a financial crisis now festering in the West and perhaps getting worse those tectonic shifts are going to shift even more. Now, there was a really extraordinary exchange between Putin and Xi as the two apparently parted. Now, I haven't seen any Russian or Chinese readouts of this. I'm getting it entirely from all sorts of scattered references across the media, and for that reason I'm not going to quote the exact words, but it seems that Xi basically said to Putin, you know, the two of us were driving the change in the world. We can see that that is true. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the West, the Western powers, have lost the diplomatic initiative, not just on a regional issue, but in terms of the way in which the world is being shaped. That is an extraordinary fact, and I wonder to what extent Western leaders have understood it. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me just remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget that you can check out our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.